Well, hi, and welcome everybody to this event sponsored by the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. My name is Simon Nicholson. I'm an associate professor in the school, and it's my pleasure and privilege to moderate today's event. The session today is inspired by World Environment Day, which took place a couple of weeks ago. World Environment Day has been celebrated every year since 1974 to generate engagement and action on environmental matters. The theme for this year's World Environment Day was ecosystem restoration. And so our plan today is to take that theme, that notion of ecosystem restoration, to look at it, to understand what it means conceptually and what it might mean for environmental action, and also to link environmental or ecosystem restoration to other things like climate change, freshwater challenges, and so forth. This is also a chance, I've got to say, for me to check in with some dear colleagues, only one of whom I've seen over the past 18 months in person, thanks to COVID. And so if time allows, we'll also broaden the conversation so we can hear from my colleagues about some of the other things I've been thinking about and working on over the last little while. We have about an hour scheduled for the session today. If you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A function. We'll get to as many questions as we're able to. The closed captioning will include all responses to questions as well as the conversation today. I've also been asked to ask all of you to refrain from recording the session. The session is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the School of International Service YouTube channel. So let me, before we get started, quickly introduce each of the panelists. I'll start with Ken Conca. My colleague Ken Conca works on global environmental governance, environmental peace building, environmental politics in the UN system and water governance, amongst other things. He was a recipient earlier this year of the prestigious Grawemeyer Award in Improving World Order for his book, An Unfinished Foundation, the UN and Global Environmental Governance. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Simon. Great to be here.
Hi. Yeah, good to see you. Next is Judy Shapiro. Judy Shapiro is one of the world's leading authorities on China and the environment. She works on a whole range of things tied to China and China's impacts on the world and the world's relationships with China when it comes to the environment. Recent books include China Goes Green, Coercive Politics for a Troubled Planet with Yifei Li. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you, Simon. Hi, Ken.
Thanks. And third, we have Paul Wapner. Paul Wapner focuses on global environmental politics, on environmental thought, environmental activism, and environmental ethics. His most recent book is titled, Is Wildness Over? Welcome, Paul.
Nice to see you all.
Yeah, and you. Judy, can I turn to you to start? What is this World Environment Day? Can you tell us some more about the background and help set the stage for us?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's super important to remember that this is not the same as Earth Day. You know, a lot of Americans think that Earth Day is the be all and end all. And of course, you know, April 22nd is burned into our minds, but World Environment Day is the UN initiative, you know, not the whole world is not Americans. And World Environment Day has a different theme each year, and it has a different host country each year. So for example, a few years ago, China was the host. I focus on China, so I think about that a lot. And their theme was air pollution. This year, the host is Pakistan, and the theme is ecosystem restoration. So, you know, in receiving Simon's prompt, which was specifically about ecosystem restoration and climate change, I was struggling a little bit because I consider myself to be very passionate about biodiversity. And one of my favorite books in the entire world is Song of the Dodo by David Cammon, spelled Q-U-A-M-M-N. And that's all about biodiversity loss and very, very little about climate change. So I ask us to think for a minute, if we didn't have this huge problem with fossil fuels, you know, if we weren't faced with climate change, we would still have an incredible crisis for biodiversity and an incredible need to restore ecosystems. The great biologist E.O. Wilson has written a book recently called Half Earth, in which he calls for the entire terrestrial and marine environment to be put off limits to human development. So that's, you know, that's the magnitude of the problem we're facing. And if you read David Cammon's book, you know, the driving forces for biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation are habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, the transmission of invasive species, these sorts of issues that have nothing necessarily to do with climate change. They have a lot to do with globalization, exploding human populations, technological changes, and our ability to transform landscapes in ways that ultimately shoot ourselves in the foot. Anyway, that's just like a preliminary thought. So the themes for this, if you look at what the UN has to say about today or last week's World Environment Day, it's a lot about the dependency between humans and the non-human world, recognition of the way we depend on nature, something about jobs creation, you need that right nowadays, payment for ecosystem services, and within all that, also a recognition that among the many ecosystem services that nature provides us are serving as a carbon sink. So, that we can reduce emissions from degradation and deforestation, we're also mitigating climate change, but we're also protecting habitat for the non-human world. That's some sort of opening thoughts from me. Thank you.
That's very helpful, Judy, thanks. Paul, I'm going to invite you to step in. So that this World Environment Day was not supposed to be a one-off event just to look for a day at the notion of ecosystem restoration. It's supposed to kick off actually a decade of UN focus on ecosystem restoration. And so I wonder what you make of this idea of ecosystem restoration as an orienting notion. What does it help us see? And what does it help us think about in terms of potential action?
Yeah, well, thanks, Simon. And again, nice to see my colleagues and nice to be here. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Simon, that this is meant to kick off a decade of concern, because we have World Environment Day, as Judy mentioned, we have Earth Day, and these seem to come up, periodically, annually, and there's this scramble to kind of do something on the day. And then it seems like we go back to this kind of business as usual. It'll be interesting to see if this World Environment Day spurs something else. The theme of ecological restoration, ecosystem restoration, to me, it offers, it's sort of, there's some challenges there, and there's some excitement and promise there. And on the challenge, I don't mean to bum us out too quickly here, but on the challenge, when we think about restoring ecosystems, there's this notion that ecosystems are these stable, homeostasis places, processes, and so forth, and that they were sort of in a pristine or sort of very healthy state, and they've gotten out of that, and we're going to get back to that. And the challenge to me, as I see it, is that these ecosystems are always changing, first of all, but anthropogenically, human beings have basically thrown an engine into them without a steering wheel in many ways, and they are changing rapidly. The oceans, are more acidic, they're hotter, the sea levels are rising, and so forth. What does it mean to bring oceans back to or restore them to another time? There's a question of what time frame we would pick, but it's hard to imagine bringing, and Ken, I'll be interested to hear what you say about water. It'd be interesting to be hard to imagine restoring them again to what? The atmosphere. We have loaded so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's hard to imagine, restoring them in the sense of washing all of that out and somehow assuming we're going to go back to some moment when these systems were in a perfect state. There are desirable states, but again, this notion of restoration is a little tricky. Same with Judy, you mentioned loss of biological diversity, this mass extinction we're having. How do we restore when we've got species that are extinct? And so it's just a sense in which I think we're moving into a time where really our management strategies are going to be managing for change, not managing for stability. and this is happening, I think, with land managers in national parks in this country and around the world, where there's this recognition that we've got to make some decisions of which species are going to live, which are not going to make it, which ecosystems within these parks are going to thrive, and which are going to be on life support. So that, to me, is the challenge. The excitement, though, is that I think that the World Environment Day is recognizing the incredible embeddedness of human beings in a wider world. That so much of the last centuries has been kind of human being is the be and end all of the world. We're the center of the universe. Everything out there is for us to use as we see fit. And not a lot, and at most that we have to worry about the environment we live in, because if it crumbles, we'll crumble. But I sense in this World Environment Day something a little more generous, something a little more expansive in worldview, which is recognizing that wildlife and other critters and creatures have their own way of being on the planet, and that we need to make room and respect and enhance and, as the theme says, even reimagine our place as humans on this planet. So I take that as good news. It's a lot of work, but it's exciting work. And I think it shifts a fundamentally anthropocentric view that we have had for, again, centuries, and invites us to expand that view, to take seriously these other beings of which we share the planet with. So I'll stop there, but it's, yeah. May we celebrate.
I'm gonna let you keep the floor for a second, Paul, just so I don't lose my train of thought in response to your remarks, if that's okay. There's a tension in what you're saying, it seems to me, right? You're talking about this expansiveness, this allowing room for other species and beings. And at the same time, you said earlier that implicit in this whole notion of ecosystem restoration is management. Is this idea that there is an engine which has been thrown into ecosystems and somehow a steering wheel needs to be installed. So I wonder if you can just help us reconcile that tension a little bit, or help us understand it.
Great comment, Simon. So, I mean, in some ways, management is one of the things we do as how we orient in the world. I manage my kids to a certain extent. You manage me, Simon. That there are, I mean, that is, it's a turn of phrase, really. We recognize the limits of management as well. And I certainly don't want to suggest that somehow we're going to find, invent, or grab hold of a steering wheel, and we are finally going to be sort of governors of this planet. We already govern evolution, I mean, through loss of biodiversity. We already govern sort of the atmosphere, but that governance is, it's not mastery. It's not full control. There is, I mean, yes, we live in the Anthropocene, but there's more to the Anthropocene than human beings. And so the suggestion is not simply that, is not a call for, okay, let's grab a hold of this, but it's simply the recognition that the way we navigate these days is not to kind of look back and have our North Star as some stable moment when we can restore, toward which we could restore ecosystems, but actually recognize that it's a moving target at this point in time. And it's a combination of the things human beings have done, and the deliberate things human beings done, and the unintended consequences of what we've done. And our job, I see it as people concerned with justice and environmental well-being, is to move forward in a way that that takes that responsibility seriously. But it certainly doesn't mean mastery.
Thanks, Paul. Ken, so Paul gave you an invitation to make connections to fresh water for us, if that's something you'd like to do, and anything else you'd like to say by way of setup.
Sure. Well, thanks. It's great to see you all. It's great to be here with you. And let me just say, I know we have a lot of American University and SIS colleagues, students, staff, and faculty on the call today. And I think we're all looking forward to doing this together in person starting in the fall. We've been trapped on Zoom for far too long, and we make it work, but it'll be great to be perhaps not shoulder to shoulder, literally, but it'll be great to be back in the same space with you all very, very soon. So Paul said he didn't want to bum us out. I'm afraid I probably am going to bum us out a little bit in talking about water. I'll start by saying I have great admiration for what the UN does. Some of the most selfless and dedicated and justice-oriented and idealistic people that I have ever encountered work with UN agencies. And much of my own work is tied to either studying the UN or working in partnership with the UN Environment Program and other groups and so on. But you know, we've already had 2 UN decades on water, and the problems remain with us. Freshwater ecosystems, rivers, lakes, estuaries, wetlands, they only cover about 1 or 2% of the surface area of the planet, but their biological productivity is really rivaled only by tropical rainforests. And yet, consider what we do. 2/3 of the world's fish stocks are either being fished to the limit or they're being overfished. And that problem is much more intense around freshwater ecosystems, largely because of intrusion, conversion, habitat destruction, pollution. Human activities contribute more nitrogen to the global nitrogen cycle. We talk about the carbon cycle. Well, there's also a global nitrogen cycle. It's a key nutrient, but it's also a pollutant when that cycle gets out of proportion. Human activities now mobilize more nitrogen than the natural background flows. We have essentially become the nitrogen cycle. And much of that excess nitrogen, through fertilizers, through car exhaust, through industrial emissions, ends up in waterways, where it creates enormous problems of pollution, of overstimulating the growth of certain life forms and so on. It's estimated that wetlands, what we would just think maybe dismissively as swamps and bogs, it's estimated that wetlands are more value. Forget the more than human world and take a narrowly anthropocentric view. Wetlands are of more economic value to human beings just by leaving them alone, through food production, through flood protection, through all the other benefits that they give us. That value adds up to being more than the land use, the conversion, the construction of housing subdevelopments or shopping malls or whatever it is that we convert wetlands into. And yet we continue to convert them at highly unsustainable rates. I haven't even mentioned climate change, which of course, water is the delivery mechanism for climate change. People are not going to walk outside on a Tuesday afternoon and smack themselves in the forehead and say, you know, it's 3 degrees Celsius, then warmer than it was, and the world has dramatically changed. People experience it through drought, through flooding, through fire, through agricultural effects, changes in soil moisture, and so on. We just had some numbers come down in the last week or two, a record number of displaced people around the planet. And the number one cause of that is now recognized as disasters and extreme weather events. We know climate change is a key driver of that, but in terms of the way that people experience it, it's climate change's effects on the natural systems that people rely upon to practice their culture, to extract their livelihoods, and to live their lives. So in some ways, the environmental agenda, the climate agenda is a water agenda. And when you look at the way that these water effects manifest themselves in the lives of people and communities, the ecosystem link is absolutely critical. And I'll make one more point and then I'll stop so we can have more of a conversation. But I appreciated your point about the tension that's embedded in this around the question of management. And my thoughts on that are actually very similar to Paul's. There's another tension embedded in this that I hope that we will talk about. And that's a tension around questions of justice. On the one hand, environmental damage, the destruction of ecosystem, the conversion of ecosystems is an enormous injustice problem. I mean, writ large, the people that are driving the changes are not the people that are suffering from the changes. And so we're called ethically to address that question. At the same time, in addressing that question, in embracing the notion of, if I agree with Paul, not strict restoration, but maybe repair, maybe changing the momentum, changing the direction of all of that damage. There's also an enormous justice question. Environmental damage really transforms the landscape. Restoration really transforms the landscape as well. And there are winners and losers in the process of those elements of conversion, those elements of restoration as well, that we very much have to keep our eye on as we talk about undoing some of this damage.
I'm taking notes, Ken, so it took me a second to unmute. So thanks. Thanks for that intervention. Judy, I'd like to bring you back in, if I may. Anything you'd like to pick up on from Paul and Ken's remarks, but also I'd love to hear how this notion of ecosystem restoration might play in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, Ken set up my comments really well. So my most recent book is called
Unrehearsed.
Unrehearsed. My most recent book, China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet, seeks to unpack the Chinese state's hidden agendas. So the Chinese state claims that it's all for ecological civilization. But if you go through and look very carefully at the tools that are being used to carry out ecological civilization, half the time they're not only protecting the environment, but they're also increasing the power of the state over the individual, both in terms of social credit score, if you don't recycle properly, but it gets even more pernicious or nefarious, to build off of what Ken is saying. Essentially, the Chinese state has been trying to get control of the ethnic minorities on the borderlands, which really make up about half the territory of China, for really centuries. States don't like nomads, as the great anthropologist James Scott told us. So now finally, in the name of green policy, the Chinese state is creating massive, bigger than Yosemite and Yellowstone combined natural areas, precisely in parts of the country where nomads have thrived and co-created ecosystems, for their entire histories. And so they're forcing the nomads into settlements in the name of creating national parks. Similarly, the big dam building spree that's going on in Southwest China and beyond the border into the Mekong and Southeast Asia can now be cloaked as, this is renewable energy, and we've made these carbon commitments to be carbon neutral by 2060. So if you're an ethnic minority person, or just, and you're there and they're saying, well, sorry, you have to move because the Chinese state has made these international promises, it becomes that much harder to resist. And so if you're a Tibetan or a Uyghur or somebody from Inner Mongolia who's trying to resist some of these ecological harms or environmental harms, then they start to tar you as a splittist or, a reactionary, and they put you into labor camp. So, this, I just want to tell one quick story that sort of made a deep impression on me. There's a place in Guizhou, which is called Caohai, which means grass sea. And that's considered to be an environmental success story because there was a lot of consultation involved, and some small dams were taken up, and it's where the black-necked crane has its wintering grounds. So I went there sort of after the fact to see this success story. And I was told by the local people that this was such a success that the state was now going to increase the size of this wetland, multifold, but the people had not been told anything about where they were going to be moved to, what kind of compensation they would have, whether there would be any benefits accruing to them personally for this thing that ultimately was going to benefit the black-necked crane, but you also knew it was going to be benefiting the tourist industry that was going to be controlled by outside interests, So it was kind of poignant to talk to these people who said, well, we just know that our street is going to be flooded, but we don't know where we're going to go, So yeah, the justice question, right? There's going to be winners and losers. And I find myself in an odd position arguing this particular point because I generally feel so strongly that humans have overstepped our boundaries and we really need to speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. But in the case of China and other authoritarian systems, I have to wonder sometimes whether what appears to be a green agenda isn't also an agenda to increase the power of the state. So, I'm done.
Thanks, Judy. Paul. If you follow Judy's lead there, I wonder if there are other connections between this theme of ecosystem restoration and your work at the moment, the sorts of things you've been thinking about, wrestling with. What else can you help us see here?
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. Let me just piggyback on that comment, though. By the way, Judy, I'm reading Barbara Demick's book, Eating Buddha, about Tibet and China. Oh, it's reminding me of your first book very much. But anyway, this question of justice is difficult. And I think the environmental movement was for decades, maybe centuries, pretty tone deaf to questions of justice. I think that much of the environmental movement, at least in the West, was very much focused on the non-human world and attempts to try to restore and sort of enhance wildness and so forth. And I think it's gotten a tough education over the years. And today, the climate movement is really a climate justice movement. And so much of the environmental movement has begun to integrate how do we take care of people and be equitable in our actions as well. But it's been slow in the coming and it's been a rough ride. And part of it is because, as Judy suggests, it's not always clear how these various goals line up with each other. It reminds me of the title of that famous essay, Are You an Environmentalist or Do You Work for a Living? I mean, there are these kind of tensions that we want to paper thin over and suggest that, good things come together always, but it's not always clear. And I think in terms of justice, I appreciate Judy's comment that there is also interspecies justice and there's ecological justice. And so I'm hoping that as we grow as a movement, and we will continue to grow, I think it gets back to my point about restoring. I mean, we don't really want to restore the environmental movement, right? The environmental movement's this growing, learning, hopefully diversifying entity of social engagement. And as it continues to evolve, I think we're going to challenge ourselves to integrate justice in more and more creative and more profound ways. Yeah, my own work right now is going in two directions. I did, as you mentioned, I finished this book on wildness, and I'm very much interested in the fate of those elements of the world which are unpredictable, uncertain, changeable, untamable, because I feel like so much of the world is what you were suggesting earlier, this kind of management orientation and basically control the world. And frankly, it's a longer debate, but I see geoengineering a little bit in that mold. And so I'm very much interested in tracking the continuation and exuberance of wildness in the world. The other piece of my work right now is over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be offering a series. There's a speaker series and a workshop on something called contemplative environmentalism. And this is a work that recognizes that while there's an outer ecology, There's also an inner ecology in human experience, and trying to explore the connections between our interior experience and our environmental engagements. Basically, the punchline there is that by engaging outward and taking on questions of justice, actually we deepen our inner lives. And in deepening our inner lives, I also think we actually kind of prepare ourselves for the hard work of social change. So, but those are other directions, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Paul. And I'll toss it to Ken. Just let me, before I get it to you, Ken, just note that there are a couple of questions starting to come in. Let me invite others in the audience, if you have questions, to start posing them to the panelists through the Q&A function, and we'll turn to them in a moment. Ken, I know you're thinking about questions around mobility and migration, around conflict and peace building, around the functioning of the UN system. I wonder if there are other connections out of your current work that you'd like to draw for us.
Sure. Yeah. So a couple of things. One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately in the context of my water work is flooding, flood adaptation, and flood resilience. And I think it's a good example of some of these questions about justice, transformation, the limits of managerialism, the agendas of the state or other powerful actors, and so on. We've watched for the last decade plus here in the United States a string of American cities be taken down by some combination of coastal flooding and flash flooding. New Orleans, New York, and Hurricane Sandy, Houston, Puerto Rico, and of course this is a problem all around the world. And one of the things I think we're learning several lessons from that. First, coming soon to a city or town or stretch of coastline or floodplain near you is the same problem. Second, that again, it is the poor, it is the less powerful, it is racial and ethnic and religious minorities that suffer predominantly from the effects of this. But also that we can't solve these problems with pumps and pipes and retaining walls, and here in the US, calling in the Army Corps of Engineers to build bigger and bigger sort of earthworks and concrete apparatus to manage it. And so a popular concept now is this idea of making room for the water, making room for the river, that our landscapes have to be able to flood. Flooding is part of the natural cycle, and we have to create landscapes that aren't destroyed simply because it floods. And I entirely agree with that as far as it goes, but the question we have to ask is, who has to make room? In cities, the people who are asked to make room are often established low-income communities that get swept aside in a struggle over increasingly valuable real estate that can be converted to some other use in a more flood-resilient sort of way. In coastal zones and floodplains, it's often people who lack secure property rights to the land that they occupy. Indigenous communities, squatters, ethnic and religious minorities of various forms in many countries, and the rural poor. And so a lot of what I've been trying to think about is what is the justice agenda in adaptation, in resilience? We have to move in that direction of reworking our landscapes. How do we do it in a way that's equitable, that gives communities voice, that gives them some control over their own future? The second thing is, it's not just a question of justice, it's also very much a question of violence. And again, it's the double-edged problem. There's an enormous problem of violence around natural resource management, around environmental conversion, around environmental change. And one of the things I've been doing for several years now is working with the Disasters and Conflicts branch of the UN Environment Program, which typically will partner with countries that are emerging from war and conflict, or emerging from the devastation of a disaster, an earthquake or hurricane or what it may be, and really focused not on restoration, but really on recovery and a renewed trajectory of growth, and maybe a peacemaking challenge at the same time. And on the one hand, I think what we've learned is there's an enormous potential to use environmental restoration, environmental recovery, a sort of a green sensibility about the future to bring people together, to enhance trust among communities where trust may be in great supply, and to create more sustainable livelihoods for people whose livelihoods have been devastated by disaster or conflict. At the same time, the stakes in that work are very, very high because there's a strong agenda of plundering the resources to get the national economy back on a growth-oriented trajectory, and sort of, going back to sort of the business as usual that may have been a piece of the violence in the first place. And so a lot of the work that I've done, whether it's partnering with the UN Environment Program or with local NGOs or what have you, is trying to understand ways in which in that moment of recovery, which in some cases can be a very optimistic and forward-looking moment. Again, how to make sure that the green agenda is also, a justice agenda and an equity agenda.
Thanks. Let me turn to some of the questions we're getting from folks in the audience. And the first question here is from Maura. Hi, Maura. Nice to be in touch with you again. The question is about the COVID moment. Maura makes the point that because of what's happened during COVID in terms of human activity, human mobility, and so forth, some of the pressures have been taken off ecosystems. And so the example Maura gives here is that we're seeing the return of certain marine animals and birds to, say, the canals in Venice. And so I guess the question here is there anything to take from this COVID moment forward as human beings wrestle with this idea of ecosystem restoration? Or are we just going to head back to business as usual? Judy, Ken, Paul, any thoughts on that question? Judy?
No. One question that I wrestle with a lot, because I'm often asked by journalists to talk about US-China relations and US-China climate cooperation. And yet at the same time, of course, the US-China relationship is very negative because of China's human rights abuses and problems in Hong Kong and Taiwan and the South China Sea, and and trade problems and currency problems and on and on. And I've been making the argument largely that two issues should be sort of sacrosanct. One should be climate change and the other should be public health. And those issues should, we should be able to come together on those. But then you can also make the point that all of those issues are actually embedded in like trade and human rights and all that. So it's hard to disaggregate issues from one another. But at this moment, actually, they just had a G7 meeting, and in this moment, G7 countries agreed to try to counterbalance China's Belt and Road Initiative with a bunch of infrastructure lending and that would be green. So we're going to build railroads, which China is already doing, of course, and wind farms and all of that. So in a way, that's a
I think we want that infrastructure a little more quickly.
In a way, that's a good moment to transition to someone else. Maybe I'll say a word or two about it. I appreciate the question. I've been wrestling with this myself, and I don't think any of us, has all of the answers or a quick and glib response to this very, very challenging question. But I'll just say a few of the things that have been on my mind and that I've been wrestling with. First, it's striking that the number of people who die prematurely every year from air pollution, often indoor air pollution, often women, given the gendered household division of labor in many parts of the world. The number of people who die from unsafe drinking water or poor sanitation, that's COVID scale already. So we've basically been living with a silent COVID for as long as any of us can remember. And so on the one hand, it's striking, and maybe there's potential in the fact that COVID concentrates our attention on our poor preparedness, our hubris, the inefficacy of some of our basic systems, for governance, for public health, and so on. But let's not kid ourselves. For many people, COVID kind of has to get in line as a problem and as a threat and as a risk. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is this has been an astonishing wake-up call for anyone who is paying attention about state capacity. When you look at how country after country has stumbled through the response, and they'll get some good media for a month and then boom, they're right back in the soup again. And so we need to really, really step back, and in all of the advocacy work that we do or all of the scholarly work that we do, we need to really, really recenter this question of what are governments capable of, what are administrative systems, modern scientific and administrative systems capable of, and how do we enhance those capabilities in the way that we need. It was astonishing what was done to develop the vaccine. Quickest vaccine prior to this took 4 years. I think it was, I don't know, it's pertussis or something like that. And so it's astonishing. And we've put all our muscle into that sort of a response, but look at all of the other fundamental elemental ways in which we've really, really lacked capacity. And so we've all got to internalize that kind of thinking into the work we do going forward.
If I could just
add. Let me, sorry, Paul. I'll also plant these other questions. So if you want to respond to this one, certainly about the post-COVID moment, but there's also a question here about whether capitalism is fundamentally opposed to environmentalism. I figure you might be a good person to pick up on that question, Paul. And a further question here about how do the panelists feel about the idea of technology and geoengineering being used as an excuse to not actually change human behavior? This technology will save us notion, and how you think about that, Paul. So 3 big questions on the table for you. I'll let you take them as you wish.
I think, Simon, you have to answer the geotechnology section. Not us, that's your question.
Let's hear from Paul first. Paul.
Well, it sounds like these questions must be coming from current students or alums, because it sounds like they're coming right out of everything we discuss. And so it's really a delight to hear the questions, but incredibly challenging to think about responses that could make some headway. I wanted just to add about the COVID moment that there's a possibility of 2 lessons, though, in addition to state capacity and so forth. And one is that there's a possibility that science can matter now, and that there's a kind of an opportunity to have more of an embrace of scientific fact and so forth. There's still lots of things unknown about this virus. Even the origins are still somewhat unknown. But there does seem to be a kind of a growing re-embrace, I'll say, of scientific fact. I think that's a good thing. The second thing I would just add is that it also demonstrates how quickly the world can pivot when faced with the challenge. That it was sort of, within, in some countries, weeks, other countries, just a few months, where behavior changed in a radical way and in a dramatic way. Not to everybody's liking, wasn't always, consensus by any means, but we did see widespread change very quickly. And to me, that's also promising to the degree we have, we want to focus on climate behavior and so forth. The question of capitalism, what is that? Capitalism. The question is it compatible with environmental well-being? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that in my lifetime, in my kids' lifetime, and in their kids' lifetime, capitalism is pretty much going to be around. And as much as I feel like strategically I resonate with systems transforming, I think putting a human face on capitalism and creating social welfare systems within a capitalist system is fundamental to whether we're going to transform the system or not. But I think it is the, a tiger, if not the tiger, in the center of this conversation in many ways. But I know it's not possible to wish away. And if we wished it away, I think we'd probably invent some version of it on the other side. And so I put my efforts into a kind of humanization of this world we're living in. I'm less concerned about, are we going to get through this portal of environmental intensification and what's on the other side of it, than how do we comport ourselves in this moment, in this portal, in this time of intensification. So not a great answer, but that's really how I feel.
Judy, you're back with us.
No, yeah, I am. I apologize. Simon, you need to answer the question about geoengineering.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll pick up on Paul's comment then about this being an opportunity to re-embrace science. I hope that's true, Paul, because I think having some common basis for understanding the world that we live in is probably just like a good thing. It's very different than the world we've been inhabiting for the past few years, at least in the United States in particular. But even if there's agreement on the world as it is, that doesn't necessarily give us agreement about what the world ought to be, right? And so even if we understand in a common way what the environmental challenge looks like, there are lots of different futures available to us. That's the stuff of politics. It's the contestation over the futures that are being created. That is the stuff that we look at when we're thinking about global environmental politics, in part, right? What I can say is that every future available to us is going to be highly technological. There's no turning away from that. We are technological creatures through and through. Human beings, for as long as there have been human beings on the planet, have been manipulating the world for human well-being, either individual or group. We have global reach now through our technological prowess, but we're not going to suddenly turn off the lights tomorrow and start shivering again in the caves. That's not one of the futures available to us. And so the question to me around geoengineering and so forth is, are there forms of technology that are compatible with the other things that human beings want and need in the creation of good futures? So it's not geoengineering or not, it's are there forms of geoengineering that might be compatible with a just, ecologically sustainable world? If there aren't, then let's turn away from even investigation of geoengineering. But if it's possible to imagine forms of intervention in the atmosphere that might alleviate climate suffering in ways that are generally good for those who are most disadvantaged, then maybe there's something there to be considered, right? And so all I'd urge is a turning away from knee-jerk responses for or against certain types of thinking or certain types of action just because they're compatible with broad categories that we carry in our heads. The world's too complicated for that now. We need to have really deep, nuanced discussions about the sorts of options that are available to us. This whole linkage between ecosystem restoration and climate change is premised on the idea, I think, that there are so-called nature-based solutions that are available. Nature-based solutions is a term that NGOs and others have started to use that might help us address climate change, right? So you can draw down more carbon dioxide into sinks that are out there in ecosystems in ways that are good for the planet and for the people. But if we start to instrumentalize ecosystems in pursuit of climate goals, that could be a really problematic thing. And the example that I'm thinking of is United Airlines, for instance, announced last week they're going to start in a few years launching supersonic flights, right, between the United States and the UK, for instance, that'll make the time between New York and London 4 hours. But those will be climate neutral, because they're going to plant trees to offset the gas that's burned in making those flights. And that's a form of insanity, right? That makes no ecological sense. Those sorts of offsets could be incredibly damaging for people and for the planet as corporations scramble for the limited ecosystem space that's available for climate goals, right? And so all of the stuff that we've been talking about, this attentiveness to justice needs, the challenges involved with the state and state capacity, thinking about this urge to management or control and how we bring that under control as human beings. You know, these are critical and key questions moving forward. Well, I'm moderating, so I shouldn't be rambling. But let me invite Judy. There's a question here directly for you. Does China have an equivalent to Superfund sites? Are there currently any monitoring systems in place that hold China accountable for environmental restoration? And Ken, there's a question there from Veronica Limeberry, who's a PhD student in SAS. I'll invite you just to look at that question, and if you have a response to it, chime in after Judy.
Yeah, so In China, what gets the most attention is air pollution, and next after that is water pollution, and probably next after that is biodiversity loss. And then climate change is kind of belongs to the central committee of the Communist Party, and the people shouldn't worry about it too much. At least that's the public line. But the real hidden, terrible environmental problem is soil contamination. And if you're familiar with China, it looks like a big country, but really only a third of it is good, habitable, arable land. And one of the reasons that China's problems are so pernicious, so entrenched, is that industrial uses and agricultural uses are just cheek by jowl, everywhere you look. And so all of that heavy metal comes out of the smokestacks, lands on the arable land, gets sucked up by the rice and the wheat, gets into your mouth, gets into my mouth, gets into everybody's mouth. So in a way, I want to say, and maybe the person who asked this question is an expert on Superfund sites, I don't know. I want to say, like, all of Eastern China is a Superfund site. So how do you actually, remediate that level of soil contamination? You can't just put it in a dump truck and drive it away somewhere, right? You can't just grow a lot of ferns and then take the ferns and, I don't know, throw them in the ocean where, it just stays. So yeah, soil contamination is the sleeping issue. Keep your eye on that issue for China. And one of the reasons, I'll finish with this comment, one of the reasons your ordinary Chinese person is so upset about pollution is that they're afraid to breathe the air, they're afraid to drink the water. And in the food area, we've had heavy metal contamination of tea, pork, rice, infant formula. These are like things that go to Chinese identity, right? Tea, pork, rice, infant formula. I forgot one. Pork, tea, pork, rice, infant formula. So when you're afraid to eat, like I always tell my husband, don't buy anything made in China, even in the supermarkets in DC. So, it's a really important issue. So thanks for that question.
So on Veronica's question, I'll just briefly paraphrase the question and then offer a few thoughts. She asked me to speak a little bit about alternative governance models or alternative property rights regimes around these sort of convergent challenges of extractive industries, violence, local communities or indigenous communities lacking effective tenure around the land, around the resources, and so on and so forth, and asked a question about examples of success or examples of alternatives that might provide, if not a model, at least some innovative ideas and so on. I think it's a great question. I think there are many, many, many such examples available for us. There are a couple of billion people on the planet that live on a commons, essentially. Whether it's a stretch of coastline or a pasture land, or where either by design or de facto, privatized property rights to land and to resources are not well established. And we have lots of knowledge about how resources get allocated, access gets allocated, disputes get resolved in spaces like that. Another really interesting example is the interactions among farmers and herders in many parts of the world, which is becoming a sort of a climate conflict narrative now, that where climate change is forcing farmers and herders to fight over the same water sources and so on. And some of that is certainly going on, but there's also really, really rich traditions of farmers and herders knowing how to work these things out and knowing how to manage these things, often rooted in local systems of authority and local systems of culture. I think the problem is that people's localized creativity gets blown away by intrusion, by extraction, or just, in fact, by the rapidity of change. So I would stand the question on its head a little bit and say, what is it that we can do to create more breathing space for those kinds of schemes to be able to work themselves out locally? I think some of that is in the environmental human rights campaign, actually. I know there are problems with the human rights narrative around the environment and with human rights as a way of thinking about justice issues in general. But I think there's tremendous potential in rights-based approaches. I also think in national legal strategies. There's a really interesting campaign in Brazil now where communities, indigenous communities, that have a constitutional right under the constitution that's been a couple decades now in Brazil to free, prior, and informed consent around projects that are impact their land. But of course, that often just gets observed in the breach and the local community. So they're starting to define for the Brazilian legal system what free, prior, and informed consent means to them. You have to translate it into our language. Here's how we give consent. Our allies have to be allowed to be in the room when these conversations are being held, et cetera, et cetera. And they're doing some really innovative work to start to codify that in the hope that the courts will start using it in handing on legal judgments. And they've had it's a very steep climb, but they've had a legal victory or two. And so I think it's incumbent on us to use rights-based strategies and legal strategies to try to create that sort of breathing space. I think it's a key part of the agenda.
So, Ken, thanks so much. We have just 2 minutes left. I haven't been paying enough attention to time. So we're not going to get to all of the questions and comments, but let me just read out one comment which is in the Q&A box here. The comment reads, I think Greta is correct. Adults just don't get it. You just stop. And so that there may be an invitation for us to stop, which we'll need to do in a minute or two, but I think it's also a question for us about the sorts of things that we can offer through, for instance, the Global Environmental Politics program that we have at SIS that is relevant to and compatible with the moment that we face. Right? I mean, we think of ourselves as adults who are trying to do some good work around these environmental questions. We get to work with amazing young people who come through our program. And I got to tell you, increasingly, I'm learning far more than I think I'm providing in classrooms from the interactions that we get to have. But Judy and Paul and Ken, just in 30 seconds each, I wonder if you can characterize what you're thinking about as we start to think about the classroom again, as the fall semester starts to loom, what you're looking forward to, what you're hoping for. And what you can say about what we offer at SIS. Judy, any very quick thoughts?
No, I'm really excited to get back to the classroom, of course. Yeah, but I think that in one of our wonderful alumni conferences, somebody we had invited to be on a panel said that they remembered some of the courses that they took in the very first semester. And they said that they had been equipped to understand that environmentalism is just a multitude of schools of thought and approaches and deep-rooted analyses and ideas about what the sources of the problems are and the way we can solve them. And a lot of times people think, oh, I'm going to do environmental politics. It's going to be a narrow field. And then they get in and it's like a huge field. And to be able to train yourself to recognize where you stand on all of these issues and what resonates with you, for solutions, I think is the biggest contribution we can make, along with our amazing alumni and our being in DC and our incredible faculty and all the usual stuff. Yeah.
So Ken, 30 seconds, and then I'll give Paul the final word. Thanks, Judy.
I want to get back into the classroom so that we can immediately get out of the classroom. I think one of the hallmarks of our program is that we try to put students and faculty out into the watershed, right? Whether it's locally in DC or whether it's the practicum work some of our master's students have done in the Middle East on peace building with Israeli and Palestinian NGOs around Jordan River Valley restoration, or the partnerships we have in Costa Rica with the University for Peace and some local communities there. I don't buy the young-old distinction. I know woke young people and woke old people and everything in between. I think it's when we kind of come together in those actual spaces where people are living their lives that we all learn together. And so I want to get back in the classroom so I can immediately get out of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm reminded that when Greta spoke to the UN in one of her addresses, she started by saying, I shouldn't be here. She said, I should be in school. And that her comment really hit me because it speaks to the sort of essential role that education plays in our life and the possible increasing irrelevance of that for the world we're living in. And so Greta, to me, is sort of a fabulous disturber in my mind of the job of an educator today. One thing that I definitely disagree with, something that I used to feel. I used to think that the best way to sort of defang an activist was to send them to graduate school, because then they would get taken by these big, profound questions. The issues are much bigger than they ever thought. And they basically kind of tone down their activism. But actually, my experience in this program has been quite the opposite. That I have just seen, we've all seen our students go out and make freaking differences that are much more long-lasting and much more profound than I think we've imagined. And so, yeah, I used to think that school was kind of the great neutralizer, but I certainly don't feel that anymore. And I too am looking forward to getting back in the classroom and getting back my public education. So, yeah. And thank you very much for convening this. And thank you to Kate. And Simon, very much thank you for your moderating. And Ken and Judy, thank you for being my colleagues. Super.
And great questions, and everybody for coming.
Thank you all.